Hey everyone, this is Mark Treichel with another episode of With Flying Colors. Are you going to need a hard hat in your credit union because of the NCUA reorganization? Or is NCUA staff going to need a hard hat? Or should I just take this hard hat off? I'm going to probably talk through a few of those things. By the way, I got this hard hat when a staff member who shall rename who shall remain nameless gave this to me after we got through a particularly rough budget process with the NCUA board. I came into work one day and I had this on my chair, and it's one of my prized possessions from my time at NCUA as executive director. All right, so that you can take me seriously, I'm going to take this hat off. And we'll set it down over there. By the way, if you're listening on the podcast, you're saying what hat? This is also going onto YouTube. And this is a special edition episode based on what NCUA just communicated. Kyle Houtman, Larry Fazio, and one of Larry's staff members, Amanda Parkhill, had discussions about the NCUA buyout program, which was driven by President Trump, and initiatives to have a downsize in force, a reduction in force at federal agencies. And they walk through all that. And I'm going to walk through a highlight version of what it means for credit unions, what it means for NCUA. I'm going to follow that up with a couple additional podcasts, and I'll talk through that here at the end, and you can expect them to come out in the next couple of Tuesdays. As a reminder, most new episodes come out Tuesdays. Thursdays, we have our evergreen episodes, which are topics that live forever, that may have a new intro to them because they of things that we're seeing in credit unions with our clients in our conversations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about what happened at NCUA at the board meeting today. And I'm calling this podcast Trump's Workforce Cuts Hit NCUA: What's Changing and What's Next? As a result of President Trump Executive Order 14210, federal agencies were being pushed and are being pushed to downsize and streamline. This directive just hit the live streams at NCUA based on this board meeting that they just went through. They offered buyouts beginning in the buyout program. The buyout program has closed for 99% of those who accepted it, and they have some near final stats that I'm going to walk through here. NCUA was striving to achieve a 20% headcount cut by the end of the year. Why by the end of the year? Because the Trump initiatives were to get to a certain size by the end of the year. It's married to the Trump anticipations. So that would be about 250 people out of the 1,200 employees that were in the budget for NCUA for the year. It's been reported here and elsewhere that they've been very successful with the programs that they have. Number two, a point I want to make is that these are not layoffs. They did not have to go to an official reduction in force. Why is that? Because the voluntary programs were so well received by staff for whatever reason. Could have been because of the money, could have been because of the volume of people that NCUA has who is ready to retire or eligible for early retirement. But in any event, because NCUA is a independent agency, although some would argue that independence is being challenged by the Trump administration. Because they are independent, they have more powers to pay higher amounts, and they were able to offer $50,000 lump sums for those people who agreed to sign away their career, sign away that they would be retiring early or by the end of the year. It's voluntary. No one was forced out. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for everybody. The target was met and then some. They've got several different acronyms for what they did. I'm not going to get into those details here, but their goal was to get about 225, as I mentioned, 250. Excuse me, their goal was to get 217 participants, but actually they had 297 that took it. The central office, and by the way, after rescissions, after people who took it and then decided later that they wanted to stay, they're expecting about 250 to be gone. Net 257 that took it. There's 14 that still are within their window for deciding that they want to pull it back. So in the end, there will be between 243 and 257 NCUA staff that take it. there was a stronger participation by those in the central office versus those in the regions or ones. Again, ones is the Office of National Exam and Supervision. Regions plus ones is what is known as the field. Central office is what you would call generally mission support, although the Office of Examination of Insurance, you could argue, goes both ways. But 30% of the folks that were in the central office, so that could be attorneys, that could be the Office of Cure, where field membership is done, that could be human resources, that could be the Office of the Executive Director. 30% of staff took it at that level. 20% of the field took it. And you could argue that's because there's more senior people in the central office, which is what they said was the case. For whatever reason, is generally going to be a good thing because they've built up the central office over time, and those central office positions are not what you'd, I don't want to say they're not productive because I fully believe in mission support, but those hours do not directly get spent in credit unions to do exams, and that's where it impacts credit unions. These people going away, these 20%, they're not going to be the new folks. They're not going to be the people that have been here 10 years. They're not going to be the people that have been here 15 years. Not going to be the people that are 20 or 23. There were stories that I heard of people who wanted to be part of the early buyout but couldn't because they didn't have the 25 years in to do early retirement. And by the way, when they do early retirement, they take a big hit on what their retirement is. But some people may have been financially positioned. Some people thought, hey, I'll take this 50K kicker and I got a job offer that I can go do something else. 30% of central office folks left, 20% in the regions. Short term, that's a good thing. Long term, it's probably better if you're going to lose some people in the central office. Although I did hear they lost all of their human resource supervisors, and who's going to process all this paperwork, you might say, if all those folks are going to be leaving and some of them have already left. There are going to be situations, and NCUA talked about the fact that some places were hit harder and they're working around that. They didn't go into the specifics. And I'll talk about a little bit of that down the road in another podcast. What else did I want to talk about here? Okay, so they hit their target and then some. Central office took the biggest hit. There was some discussion around the hiring freeze that Trump put in place being until at least July 15th, emphasis on July 15th at least, because once you hit that point in time, and by the way, last Trump administration, they indicated, and I believe this is true, that the hiring freeze lasted about a year. Under the hiring freeze, assuming they don't extend it, you can only replace for every 4 jobs that went away, you can only hire 1. Now the problem with saying, okay, they can start hiring and filling positions in July is that most of these people are on the rolls until the end of the year. That in order to entice people to leave, they said, we will pay you till the end of the year. If you leave, you can just go on leave. If you stay, we'll give you a 50% bonus in your pay. So you're essentially making 50% of what you could do to work, but you're getting paid 1.5 times. So they can build up some cash and cash prizes, and they can't really replace any of these folks until the end of the year. Now, I did a previous post or podcast where I showed you there are no federal jobs out on usajobs.gov, which is where everybody posts them. It's a long tail to get those people up and hired. So hopefully at some juncture, they're able to say, okay, we get to October, November, the Trump administration says, yes, you can start hiring for next year and they can start gearing up. One of the challenges they'll have is they don't have a lot of people in HR right now. So it's going to be a bumpy road. And that's where the hard hat could be a problem for some folks at NCUA. All right. I think it'll be less so for the credit unions, but you will feel it. And we'll get into that in maybe perhaps another episode that's coming out. All right. So that gets me to the internal realignment that's coming. There's a lot of verbiage that I've gone through and come up with. They're talking about potentially streamlining operations, alluding to fewer departments, saying that at the time there were 23 department heads. What does that mean? That some of them have left? Yes, but I also think it means that they're going to be shrinking some departments, and I'm going to save my details relative to that to another episode that will be coming out specifically on the shrinkage at NCUA and the reconfiguring at NCUA. I'm going to apply what I know from my 34 years at NCUA, my 10 years in the Office of the Executive Director, 7 of which as Executive Director, working directly for the NCUA board. And I'll walk through how I think they might realign, because there's some pretty obvious things that I would do if I was there. And I will probably come up with a flow chart, a org chart of what I think NCUA should look like moving forward based on what they are planning on doing. They also talked about exam cycles being extended for strong credit unions, talked about what the timeline for the $1 billion to $15 billion credit unions, that those can now be stretched up to every 20 months. Smaller credit unions, so smaller being under a billion, could be between 14 and 24 months. And they talked about how that's driven by Camel, how that's driven by management consistency. They made reference to one of their websites on the exam flexibility program, which I want to go do some research on. And I thought I heard them say that if you're a Camel 3 or newly chartered, that you'll see us every 8 to 12 months. That's different. It used to be 6 months that you had to have an examination, a follow-up examination at a code 3. It's quite possible that they put that in there only relative to full exams because Camel 3s, 4s, and 5s are going to get them more frequently. But I'm going to be watching what's going to happen to Camel Code 3s because I'll be very surprised if they don't try and keep those on a 6-month cycle. Because if they don't, that will lead to bigger losses in credit unions. And oh, by the way, in the earlier briefing, they talked about the insurance fund. I will have a separate podcast on that. They're very excited about their new dashboard. The public can't see all of the dashboard yet. I'm going to look at the old PowerPoints they did and how much they revealed about camel codes and see if they're being as transparent as they used to be. I don't know the answer to that because they only had 2 sentences on camel 3s going down, no references to 4 or 5. They quickly showed the screen on the camels, which would have had some detail about 4s and 5s. I want to dig into that, and I'll have a podcast relative to that to see if I believe that their transparency has stayed the same, gotten worse, or gotten better. But stay tuned for that. That'll be a separate podcast coming out as well. They also talked about budget savings of $75 million in 2026. So again, NCUA's budget will be tight this year, and that's because they're paying $50K roughly to everybody who is going away as a lovely parting gift. And I say that tongue in cheek to encourage someone to leave because of the safety of their government job. They needed to entice them. So it's a little tongue in cheek. Hey, if you're an NCUA staffer listening to this, no ill will. It makes sense that they gave you a decent amount of money to make a decision to leave, et cetera, et cetera. But $75 million in savings anticipated in 2026. That would be salary, that would be benefits, that would be payments they make to OPM for those benefits, that would be travel related to those people who are no longer going to be there, et cetera, et cetera. And they talked about the fact that they will take some of that money, improve their technology. They talked about the fact that they would be using that technology to do exams in better ways. They talked about that some of that money will go back to credit unions in a reduced operating fee, which is good. But again, as I always like to say, and it's something NCUA never really talked about, the cost of the NCUA program on a credit union's budget is essentially a little bit less than what credit unions do to train their staff, to go to CUNA meetings, America's credit unions, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really not all that material, even though the trades like to make it a big deal, but it is savings. So I don't want to discount that as well. And if you're a credit union that would lose money but for a reduced NCUA budget, I'm sure you'd rather make money and save a few $1,000s depending on where you're at in the cascade of assets and the costs of all that. So there was a quote about less with less, not more with less. Hauptman said, we're not going to have less and be able to do more. That's a nonsense type statement. So it's good that they have that reality, but they're rethinking processes. They imply that they've got a lot of good suggestions from NCUA, and they joke that one of the suggestions from NCUA staff that they would not be taking was to have the thermostat at 78 in August. A little bit of tongue in cheek there. They got a good laugh about that. And what else? Tech and talent investments are coming. They implied that they're going to have better technology and that they're going to do hiring and that they're going to fill some critical roles. They talked about, and I've posted on LinkedIn a little bit, NCUA will rise to the occasion. They are losing a lot of really talented people because if you're eligible to retire, you've been there a long time. And they've made reference to executives. I know I've had conversations with some executives who I know are leaving, some I know are staying. I don't want to get into specifics here, but they're losing a lot of really talented people. Let's just leave it at that. But there's people in the wings. I can figure out who I think might take future positions. If I was still there, who I'd be saying, hey, I think you should apply for this job. Not pre-selections, by the way. No, you're just encouraging people to participate in the opportunities that are here. And there will be people that rise to the occasion. We used to call that a deep selection when someone's been there a short time but has a lot of opportunity. and may not be perfectly positioned for a position yet, there's going to be people that will rise to the occasion relative to that. All right, that's it in a nutshell here on this first episode. Central office hit harder. Exams hit pretty hard. There's going to be a realignment coming. I'll have a separate podcast on that. And again, I'm going to put the hard hat back on. I think NCUA staff should be prepared for some challenges, but they are up to the occasion. You don't want to take a blunt force trauma to the head. Credit unions, your exam, you might not have the same examiner. You might not have the same supervisory examiner, but the reality is you will have an exam. And if you find out that you need some help with that, who to reach out to, you can reach out to find out how we help our clients save time and money with NCUA so that they have a smoother exam process. That's it for this episode. I hope you have a fabulous Memorial Day weekend and that you're somewhere in the country where it's not raining. As always, I appreciate you listening. I hope you will listen again soon. This is Mark Treichel signing off with Flying Colors.